170 days ago today, the 52 American hostages returned from Iran after 444 days of humiliation and abuse. Tonight on Inside Politics, we'll examine the Iran hostage crisis with one of those at the center of the storm. Good evening, everybody. I'm Bruce Dumont, your host for Inside Politics. I thank you very much for joining us on this rather hot Thursday night, and I am pleased to welcome to our studios Colonel Charles Scott, who was one of the 52 Americans held hostage by Iran. Colonel Scott was Chief of Defense and liaison between the U.S. Department of Defense and the Iranian military sector prior to the takeover of the embassy on November 4th of 1979. Also joining us this evening, I am pleased to welcome Jim Bishop, one of America's most well-known and successful writers, journalists. He is author of a number of bestsellers, including The Day Lincoln Was Shot, The Day Christ Died, The Day Kennedy Was Shot, and his new book, an autobiography, is called A Bishop's Confession. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us tonight on Inside Politics. I'd like to begin, since you've done a number of days in the life of historic people and events, Jim, I'd like to kind of look back on a historic day in U.S. history, November 4th, 1979. That was the day that the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, was taken over. And let us turn to you, Colonel Scott, and ask for your recollections of that day. Where were you at 11:10 in the morning when you first had feelings that things were getting out of hand at the embassy?
Well, actually, the day started out to be a routine day. It was a Sunday morning. In Iran, you work on Sundays because the holiday is Rosh Jomeh, which is our Friday. Saturday had been a religious holiday, so we were really just back to work after a two-day break for most of the embassy staff. We had our normal 9 o'clock staff meeting with all the section chiefs, with Mr. Bruce Langen, the charge in charge. The meeting broke up about 9:30, and we went about the daily routine. Unfortunately didn't have any calls to make that morning, or I would have been gone immediately after the staff meeting. For those of you who watched the program on television, Escape from Iran, the Canadian caper, there was what I consider a gross error in that, and that was the inference that the takeover of the embassy was sort of a spontaneous act by a group of terrorists who happened to be milling around outside the embassy gates. That's patently incorrect. What actually happened about 9:45, a large group of militants came down the street in basically a military formation, immediately scaled the wall at the main gate, cut the chain off the main gate with bolt cutters, and within about 10 minutes were in the basement of the Chancellery building. At the same time that they did that, they hit the two major apartment buildings off the embassy complex that housed embassy personnel, the Bijan and the Ardalan, and broke doors to apartments down, taking as hostage immediately those embassy personnel who were off duty. By the time the embassy finally was penetrated, the upstairs at about 11:10 or 11:30 in the morning, I was on the telephone talking to Mr. Bruce Langen, the charge, painting a picture for him over at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of just exactly what was going on.
When you look back on that particular day and that particular incident, what would you have done differently had you been given the opportunity to do so?
Well, at the risk of being facetious, I wouldn't have been there. I would have found another place to be that day, but really there was...
What orders did you have? When you see these things happen, it would seem to me that some form of defense mechanism should have gone into effect. Did one go into effect at that time, or were you allowed, or were you instructed just not to shoot or not to do anything if you were going to be attacked?
We were given specific instructions that day when the embassy wall was penetrated not to raise the level of violence, not to shoot at the terrorists. And I think that decision was a good decision.
Who gave that order?
Mr. Langen.
I see. And was there a Marine detachment in charge of the defensive perimeter?
No, there is no defensive perimeter, and that's a common error that's made by people. There's no way you can defend an embassy in a hostile city with a population of 4.5 million people.
I agree with that, but then why do you need the Marines at all?
The Marines are there really for the defense of the ambassador's person, and they are there to effect a delaying action if necessary to give embassy staff personnel time to destroy sensitive equipment if the embassy is breached. responsibility for embassy security all over the world is the responsibility of the host government security forces.
Yes.
The building of an embassy and the actual physical setup prohibits any actual defense, as I know defense as a military officer. All we had were barriers to penetration, and those are only delay. And those were steel doors, but there was no fire that you could bring to bear outside the doors because you were all inside. So all you were doing was effecting a maximum delay to keep them out as long as possible. There is no...
When the news first burst upon us, here, of course we had very little real knowledge of what was going on. But the idea that the embassy could be breached sort of made us feel that even though it was a forlorn action, the Marines should have fired on men who were coming over the walls and using wire cutters to get in through the gate. And of course we had no understanding of the problem because we hadn't been told what it was like. But we always thought of the Marine unit as, let us say, as it was in the early 1800s in Tripoli, where they defended everything to the last man.
Or in Morocco.
Or in Morocco.
Yeah.
And this is the way we saw
that is
it,
not the mission.
just as readers, as people.
Yeah.
Colonel, when did you first have your first face-to-face confrontation with one of the invaders?
Well, the minute they walked in and snatched the phone out of my hand.
What did they say?
Well, they asked me who I was talking to, and I told them none of their business. And that was about all they said. They tied me and blindfolded me, and I started moving out with the rest of the embassy.
Were they rough? Did they manhandle you at the time?
Yeah, very
And
much
other
so.
people in the room at the time? What happened then? From that point on, you went through, a 5.5-month period when you didn't talk to anyone.
That's right.
But did that start right away, or was there interrogation that started on you almost immediately?
Well, that day we were taken over. I was taken over to the residence where I had been living, the ambassador's house, and continually blindfolded, tied to a chair facing the wall, and people were in there with weapons the rest of that afternoon. And it appeared at any point in time there, from the conversation in Persian, and I speak Persian, that they might be going to execute all of us at any time. Well, at that time, what was actually going on was they were trying to get into the vault area. We had some people who had stayed behind and gone in and locked themselves in the vault to complete the destruction effort. So it was later that afternoon before they actually were captured. When they got inside the vault. That was about 2:30 or so. Then that evening, they began my interrogation.
When you were on the phone with the Chargé d'Affaires, Mr. Langan, was one of the things that you were discussing the destruction of the intelligence material in the vault? Or was that going on prior to your conversation?
That was already going on.
And that decision was made by the Chargé d'Affaires?
To go ahead and destroy?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Describe for us, if you can, the interrogation process, because I know in a conversation you and I had earlier, it was a horrendous period for you.
Yeah, I spent about 3.5 weeks being almost continually interrogated, sometimes as much as 20 hours straight, 20 hours a day, and then moved from place to place with the attempt to deny me as much sleep as possible. What they were trying to do there is get you so tired that you'd be confused and admit to almost anything just to get some sleep. I could sense that right away, so based on books that I had read before on the subject of interrogation and brainwashing, I knew that in order to keep my willpower from becoming a floating line under that kind of strain, I had to develop some objectives and goals. The goals that I set for myself at that time were, first, that I wouldn't write anything for them, because they were looking for something they could wave around and say, see, we have a confession. It wouldn't matter what it said, just so it was in my handwriting or any individual key person from the embassy's handwriting. And generally what I'm saying now goes along with what we call in the military the code of conduct, which applies to prisoners of war. I made up my mind that no matter what they did, I wouldn't say anything that would bring discredit on the United States or be embarrassing to the United States. I would give them no information that would be endanger the lives or the safety of any of the other hostages, and that no matter what they did to me, I wouldn't admit anything that I thought they would want to bring me to trial for, based on my assignments previously in Iran, where I had worked as a military attaché. And there were times in the next couple of weeks under the interrogation when I'm glad I set those goals, because your mind will play tricks on you when you get very fatigued and under that kind of stress. And
Did they know who you were?
Yes, they did.
Did you ever find out how they knew that?
I knew how they knew it.
How?
They were told.
They were told. By who?
They were told by one of our own people.
Do you know who?
Yes.
Would you care to identify him?
No. But they were told that I was Colonel Charles W. Scott, that I spoke Persian, and that I had been in Iran before as an attaché.
Let me bring up a very difficult question early in the discussion, if I may. Recently, Joseph Subik, one of the military personnel at the embassy, was omitted from receiving honors by the U.S. government. In a conversation that you and I had earlier in the day, you didn't really want to comment too much on what happened to Joseph Subik, although I think you, if I may paraphrase, I think you said that perhaps the decision made by the government was a correct one. Joseph Subik, at this moment, appears to be the one name that keeps coming to the top as the name of a person who might have collaborated with the Iranians. Is it your opinion that there are other names that would share some of the blame with Joseph Subik?
I don't even have an opinion on that. I don't. I spent so much time alone that I'm not aware of. I'm not aware of who was involved in that kind of actions.
But you aren't aware that there were others, even though you would not know who they are?
No.
Let me ask you this question. How many people in total were in the embassy? The total number?
Americans?
Yes.
You mean initially?
Yes. That
About
day.
66.
About 66.
Well, in the embassy.
Yes.
Now that's, that became hostages. I think the figure was 66. They were not all physically present in the embassy. Some were picked up in the counselor section. Some were over in their apartments, as I said earlier, and they were brought over to the embassy and became hostages as soon as they were dragged out of their rooms after the doors were broken down out of their apartments.
Don't you think you had a rather high level of resistance to what these hoodlums or government-inspired hoodlums wanted? That you really had a crew that you could be proud of?
Oh, I think absolutely.
Compared to, I mean, one person who might have weakened, or two persons who might have weakened out of 66, I think that's a marvelous record.
I think across the board, and I've used the term that we were sort of a cross-section of the American people. We had civilians there from State Department and other agencies in Washington. We had Marines, Army, Navy, and Air Force representatives.
Yeah.
But when I look back at the assignment criteria for Iran and post-revolutionary Iran, just about everyone there was hand-picked, and they were pretty much across the board, very, very tenacious, strong, solid citizens with
a lot of tenacity and
a lot of guts, just plain guts.
This to me is incredible, because I think in the time value, which is 444 days, I can't imagine myself resisting that length of time. I can imagine myself just little by little crumbling, just saying it's useless, it's pointless to keep resisting. And yet you had a high number. You had a high percentage.
But I'm going to argue with you. I think that Americans generally underestimate our capability to handle a stress situation like that, and I'll tell you why I feel that way. And I've seen it in over 30 years of leading soldiers, including war and peace. Americans are very difficult people to push around. You can push us a little bit, and you might scare us. You might scare us quite a bit. And then we reach a point where we get angry. And when we get angry, we get tough. And when we get tough, we can handle just about any kind of a situation, because with that toughness comes a high level of stubbornness. And I think that just watching people all over the rest of the world and then watching Americans, we're a lot tougher and a lot more stubborn than we sometimes give ourselves credit for being. And when we know the adrenaline has to flow because we're the guy that's out there in the trenches making either making our country look good or look bad, it gives us great strength that we don't realize we have. Now, in some little petty situation that didn't matter, you might break. But I would offer that you'd probably be just as tough or tougher than I was because of your background and the kind of discipline that I know you have, or you wouldn't be able to do the kind of research you've done on the books you've written.
Were there reports? You mentioned that you were isolated for 5.5 months. How did you communicate with others? Because there were forms of communication that were used.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we really began to communicate extensively, and I say extensively, to where if one person knew something, within a period of a few days, just about everybody in that cell block or in that general location had basically the same information. We did it by little tricky methods such as tap codes. You take a matrix of squares, 25 and all 5 across and 5 down, and start out from left to right, A, B, C, D, E, and then F, and then you put numbers 1 through 5 outside the boxes and 1 through 5 down. And if you want to send a B, it's just 1 tap, 2 taps. That's a B every time. And you can send complete messages that way. And after you've used it a while, simplest code you can possibly imagine. And people will say, the real sharpies will say, what about the Z? There's 26 letters in the English alphabet. You hardly ever use a Z, but if you need one, it's 1 tap and then 6 taps.
What type of messages would you send? What were you trying to communicate?
Any kind of information that we could gather on what was going on, either internally or information what was going on back in the States toward getting us out. For example, when we learned that Walter Cronkite was announcing each night at the end of his news show that this is the 89th day that the Americans in Iran have been held hostage, that was kind of a morale boost for us because we knew that the people back here were at least being reminded once a day that we were still there.
What about the letters from children and Americans of all ages that were sent to the embassy? Did they ever get through?
Some of them did. A lot of them never got to me. Some of the most informative letters that I got, believe it or not, were from little 3rd grade children. When a 3rd grade child writes something, it's totally uninhibited, and most of our people had been warned in the United States, I know my family had, against putting anything political or anything informative of the political situation in the letters. But the children hadn't been told that, or if they had, they didn't recognize it. So when the Shah left the States, I got a letter from a child out in Omaha that said, referred to the Shah leaving the States. And that's how I actually found that out, or confirmed it. I'd heard the rumor from other sources. Those letters from children were the first indication I had. I'm an old intelligence analyst, really, in a lot of ways, that you all back here, and I'm kind of learning to say that like a native Georgian now, you all back here in the States really cared about us and were thinking about us, because I think what our children in the 3rd and 4th grade say is a reflection of both what their teachers tell them and what they hear at home every night. And at that time, it was obvious in America that there was an awful lot of conversation and an awful lot of interest in the 52 or whatever hostages.
It surmounted all other news, and yet it was a continuing process. And my experience in news, which has been my life study, is that news after the 9th day tends to wind down, 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 down until it fades away. And as you said, it wasn't just Walter Cronkite. It was in every home, every night. People were saying, well, why doesn't the government do something? Not that they knew what the government should do, but merely in their helplessness. They
frustration.
Uncle Sam should think of something to do to correct the situation. And this was paramount.
That must have also been an important element in keeping your faith throughout that 444 days that you knew an entire nation was concerned about you.
I think, I got a few letters from my family, and inferences in those. My wife was very careful about what she wrote because she wanted the letters to get through. But there were inferences there of the tremendous interest in the hostage crisis. You mentioned the news shifting from page 1 all the way over to the obituaries eventually, and I preached that to the Iranians after the interrogation. I said, you people have launched something that you're not going to win on. Right. We lose more than 50 people in America in weekend accidents every week, and you're not going to hold the attention of the American population. I misjudged that very long. And I really believed that the first couple of months until we started getting this positive feedback in what mail we did get, and even from some of the terrorists who said, you would be amazed at the interest in America in you.
Oh, yes.
You are the #1 news story.
Every day.
One tactic that is frequently used in interrogation, specifically police interrogation, Jim, I think, can attest to this, being an old police crime reporter. There's the good cop, bad cop. When you were being interrogated, did you have people who were trying to be friends with you?
Oh, yes. They were pros. They were pros. They'd do something like the bad guys that take me out in the yard and walk me around and let me walk into trees while I was blindfolded. And they'd bring me back in, and one guy would offer me a cigarette. Don't pay any attention to those people. Cooperate with me. The old principles of interrogation 101, I call it.
Right.
But they had some professionals. They knew what they were doing.
I'm surprised, really, that they were that sophisticated. What you're saying really surprises me, because our feeling here was that they were highly religious, sort of backward country, militarily, civically, that they tended to riotous outbursts for or against something, tremendous parades even before this thing happened, and demonstrations, but not the kind of people Americans would really relate to.
Yeah. The one thing that's kind of difficult to explain to Westerners in understanding the Iranian psyche is that Iranians, if you get them in a group and get them all volatile about something, are some of the most sadistic, unpredictable people in the world. They make an awesome mob. But one-on-one, the average Iranian, now there are exceptions among this terrorist organization, the average Iranian is a very, very hospitable, understanding, and compassionate individual. It's just part of their ta'aruf, they call it in Persian, or their manners.
But
An Iranian, I'm sure, if they finally decided to shoot us, some of those terrorists would have come up and said, hey, I'm very sorry at what's going to happen now. I don't have anything to do with it, but the Imam, Khomeini, has said, you must be shot, so goodbye. It was it wasn't a personal thing in that sense.
Yes.
At any point during your captivity, was there any suggestion that the Soviet Union or Marxist efforts were being used either in interrogation process? That was never discussed at all?
No. And I don't believe that the people that had us, they call themselves the Danish-Juyane Khat-e Imam, or the Muslim students, followers of the Imam's path, is the name they gave themselves. I believe they were even more anti-Soviet than they were anti-U.S. and anti-Shah. And any indication at any time that they were working with the Soviets or working with Marxists was immediately denied, and I mean very vociferously and adamantly. I don't believe they had any affiliation with communist Russia at all.
Joining us tonight on Inside Politics, we have Colonel Charles Scott, who was one of the 52 Americans held hostage for 444 days. Also joining us this evening is Jim Bishop, one of America's most well-known journalist authors, author of a number of bestsellers. His most recent book is called A Bishop's Confession, which is an autobiographical look at a distinguished career as an American journalist and best-selling author of such books as The Day Lincoln Was Shot, The Day Kennedy Was Shot, and The Day Christ Died. 236-1531 is our telephone number. We should also mention that Colonel Scott is in town for a stress seminar that will be held tomorrow night at Glendale Heights Community Hospital out in Glendale Heights. And if you want to get pencil and paper a little bit later on in the program, we're going to give you a little more information about that should you wish to go out and hear Colonel Scott in a lecture situation tomorrow evening. We'll also be giving you a phone number. 236-1531 is our telephone number again this evening. Because of our special guests, we will restrict calls this evening to questions about the Iran hostage crisis. 236-1531 should you have a question for Colonel Charles Scott or Jim Bishop. Colonel, let's turn to a couple of other important days during those 444 days. One was the day, as you say, when you received word that the Shah had left the United States. I'd like to kind of backtrack a little bit to before the takeover of the embassy on November 4th, because the the Shah's admittance into the United States was something that concerned you, and I wonder if you could share with us your concern about that.
Yes, when I was alerted to go to Iran, and actually the first time in July of '79, and then the thing was called off because they had another volunteer that didn't pan out because he wasn't qualified. And then finally in August I was alerted to go to Iran shortly after I'd begun a new assignment in Atlanta. I started checking around with some of my Iranian friends and some expatriates and asking them, what was going on over there, their views on it. I knew what I'd read in the newspapers and what few intelligence reports I'd read. And I was told at almost every level by every Iranian that I talked to, from students to business people who were over here, that there was a possibility of maintaining a dialogue with the post-revolutionary government, and there might not be a complete break in relations between Iran and America, but that if the Shah were admitted to the United States, the volatility of the Iranian population as a result of that might be a real force to reckon with and might seriously jeopardize any Americans, the safety of any Americans remaining in Iran. You have to understand the Eastern mentality. They, what I call, have a Bazari mentality. International law doesn't mean anything if they feel they've been wrong. They will take whatever actions they think will bring results, and as indicated by the takeover of the embassy and the gross violation of international law and custom. But I checked around, and when I went to Washington for my briefings, I asked around up there at the various agencies if we had any plans to admit the Shah, and in every case I was told no. It's against our policy and goals for U.S. relations with Iran at this time. And our policies and goals, as they were stated to me then, were to maintain a dialogue with the new post-revolutionary government of Iran, stressing the mutual benefits of such a dialogue because we still needed Iranian oil, and our friends did. We still needed access to the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz and Lenghe. And we felt that Iran, in order to maintain any independence and viability as a new power, in order to provide for their own internal defense, would have to have spare parts for the sophisticated military equipment that they'd purchased from us during the Shah's regime.
All right. So as a good officer, you took that intelligence and you went to Iran. What was your reaction when President Carter changed his mind and admitted the Shah? What went through your mind then? Did you see the writing on the wall? Did you realize that something of some consequence was going to happen, as had been suggested to you by some Iranian friends of yours?
Yeah, I think a number of us were sort of waiting for the other shoe to fall after the 23rd of October '79 when the Shah was admitted to the States. In fact, I think many people in the State Department felt that way. The longer it went without having Iran take some sort of action, the more worried I became, because I felt that they were preparing a real Donnybrook rather than just having some of their token demonstrations or a few marches in front of the embassy.
What words were you getting from Washington? What were they telling you?
Well, I wasn't in the intelligence business over there. I was in the spare parts business, and for us it was sort of business as usual. And that was the at least there was an attempt made to have it business as usual.
Mm-hmm. Let us turn to telephone calls now. 236-1531 is our telephone number. Good evening, John. You're on the air.
Bruce, I'd like to ask the Colonel one question. I am a Vietnam veteran, and I spent 2 tours over there, and what I'd like to ask him is if he felt at all funny about the enormous celebration that was held for people who endured something horrible, and I'll admit it was horrible, and that in contrast with the folks like me who also endured a little bit and got nothing.
Okay, Colonel Scott is also a Vietnam veteran. Perhaps he's got some interesting comments for you.
Yeah, you and I have a lot in common, really. The first thing I thought when I got off the plane at Stewart Air Base and saw the throngs out there waving the American flag was the tremendous contrast between that welcome and the little old lady banging on me at San Francisco Airport in March of 1968 when I returned from Vietnam, calling me a baby killer and a murderer. And I thought I'd been doing something for my country. I've done a lot of speaking since I've been home about taking another look at the way we've treated our Vietnam veterans in this country. To me, veterans are veterans, And it doesn't matter what war they fight, and you and I both know we don't get to choose the wars we fight, and we just go off and try to do the best we can. And I think that there is a trend toward taking a look again at how Vietnam veterans were treated, and in many cases we wound up, and you wound up, being scapegoats for an unpopular war that was very divisive to this country. I think America now is just getting the guilt pangs of that treatment, and I see some changes coming about already. There are talks, we've had vetathons in Atlanta where I live to try to bring veterans up to date on some of the rights and privileges that they have, and there's also American Legions around there that this past 4th of July made a special effort to honor all of their Vietnam veterans, and I'm very much in favor of that.
God bless you, sir.
Okay.
Good night, Bruce.
Thank you. 236-1531. Glenn, you're on the air.
Yes. You know, these impounded Iranian assets sat in American banks for about a year, and somebody made quite a bit of money off that. Don't you think that money should rightly belong to the hostages rather than to the rich entrepreneurs who got it?
Colonel Scott.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you should mention that. We have just filed suit, 9 of us, in Los Angeles, a federal court for the Central District of California, against Iranian assets in the United States. The way the thing worked out, the Iranian assets that had been frozen in the United States by the president during our incarceration in Iran as part of the Algerian agreements were to be returned to Iran incrementally, the last increment of those going back to Iran the 19th of July. And that includes the interest that accrued on those funds while they were frozen in the United States. At the same time, there is a presidential commission just being formed now to examine what compensation, if any, should be provided to the ex-hostages and their families. And I've come out as saying that I don't favor that, because that will come out of United States citizens' tax dollars, including my own, and I don't feel the United States owes me a thing. I was a professional soldier over there doing what I was supposed to do. Now, Iranian assets in the States are something else. I feel that Iran owes us for a number of reasons, not anything personal, but I think that before history closes the pages on the Iran crisis, Iran must be made to know that there is a high cost to terrorism at the international level. And when a country sponsors a terrorist action, which is what happened in the case of the Iran hostage crisis, I think they need to know that you can't do that with impunity, that there's a high cost to it. And again, referring to the way Easterners think, we've already decided as a nation, our government has, that we're not going to nuke them till they glow. And I'm a firm believer that that was a good policy. I don't think it would accomplish anything to punish Iran militarily. There are many good people in Iran. But Iran should be made to, if you will, pay through the nose for what they did in violation of international law, so that next time they'll think twice, and other potential terrorists or those contemplating future acts of international terrorism will think twice before they do that. I also think that there's a question in my mind, as one of the old stare decisis of international law and common law and every other kind of law I can think of, any agreement made under duress or intimidation or threat can be declared null and void and is not enforceable. And I think that at least part of the Algerian Accords that call for return of all those monies, including interest on them, might well be declared unconstitutional. The other point I question is the right of anyone to take away a constitutional right without due process of law, and that's clearly what happened to the 52 hostages.
Glenn, thank you very much. 236-1531 is the telephone number. You were quoted in an article several weeks ago as saying that after the aborted rescue mission, your captors were scared to death about what the United States might do next. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. Right in the wake of the aborted rescue mission that went to Pata Tabas, Iran, the Iranians were really up in arms. They sort of leaned on us a little extra heavy for the next couple of weeks after that. And then I began to sense that there was, by the conversations both among the Iranian guards and when they'd come and talk to me, that they were developing a healthy respect for the United States that they had not had before. They recognized that American blood had been spilled in an effort to get us released. It was no longer a big game as far as the United States or they were concerned, and they realized that the United States had literally penetrated Iranian airspace to a considerable depth, almost gotten to Tehran, and they were very much concerned not knowing what the United States might do next. They constantly, from that point on, feared that there might be either another raid or some bombings or some sort of military action against them.
Now, you were being moved from Tehran to Tabriz at the time that you first realized that there had been a raid. Can you tell the audience exactly how you learned of the aborted raid?
Yes, you'll probably recall that the aborted rescue mission actually was on the night of 24-25 April 1980. That very next night, which is really about the time the Iranians found out about it and had time to react, I was loaded with 3 other hostages on the back of a truck, blindfolded, chained, and handcuffed, and driven without a comfort stop or anything from there to Tabriz, Iran, where I was locked in a vault up there in what had been the American consulate in Tabriz, and remained there from the 26th of April until the 11th of July. During that move up there, they had radios, FM radios, walkie-talkies in the vehicle, and also in the lead vehicle and the trail vehicle. So I knew they were anticipating a security problem of their own. And several times I heard them mention the term commando, which is commando in Persian. And so I sensed that some sort of a military action had taken place, or was in the process then.
What was your reaction to that?
Well, we were naturally anxious. We were sort of hoping there would be one come to pass before we actually got well out of Tehran. And then, of course, we realized that they were spreading people all over the country. It would be virtually, from a logistic and coordination point of view, impossible to come in and rescue all of us.
How many people were with you?
As I mentioned, there were 3 others, so there were 4 of us altogether.
Jim, you have a question? Okay. Let me turn to the telephone calls now, 236-1531. If you have questions for our guest this evening, journalist Jim Bishop, who is author of a book called The Bishop's Confession, an autobiographical look at his distinguished career in American journalism, and also Colonel Charles Scott, one of the 52 Americans held hostage. He was one of the highest-ranking military officers, held captive by the Iranians for 444 days at the time of the takeover. He was chief of defense and liaison between the U.S. Defense Department and the Iranian military sector. Good evening, Carl. You're on the air.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mr. Scott if he had any extended political discussions with his captors.
Yes, I did. Not early on. Well, yeah, early on, too, during the interrogation. I spent a lot of time telling them that they had launched a futile effort, that they were not going to be able to get the Shah back, that the United States would not react to that kind of a blackmail attempt in any way, and that even if President Carter were so inclined that because of our laws and our system of government that they wouldn't be able to get the Shah without some court action. And then later on, we had extensive discussions in Persian with them about our system of government and our system of courts and that sort of thing.
Well, that's a crucial question. All during that crisis, I never understood why that was never brought up, that the Shah under no circumstance could be returned, at least willy-nilly. He had special status in this country, I suppose habeas corpus, where he couldn't be detained, etc. And I was wondering if that was ever made clear to the captors.
Well, you see, their sense of law is not the same as ours. And that's the problem. They don't believe in Western law at all, as evidenced by their violation of international law and seizing us in the first place. They're used to working with things like blackmail and duress and that sort of thing, and it's endemic to the society.
At any point during the 444 days, did you ever wish that the Shah had been returned or would be returned?
Well, you know, that's a difficult question, because it came down to, if it came down to a point of the 52 of us or the Shah of Iran, I think emotionally we would have felt, why certainly, let's get the Shah back so we can go home. But I think we were all better citizens than that and realized there was more at stake in that issue than whether or not the Shah should be returned. When we really resorted to that kind of thinking, we were playing into the hands of the kind of mentality that our captors had. So I didn't want to see the United States embarrassed in any way. And when we first heard the 4 demands, made of the United States, and I learned of those 4 demands originally on the 1st of May while in Tabriz, when one of the Ayatollahs from Tabriz came in and talked to me and said, and I asked him after he got through his diatribe on the need for getting the Shah back and one thing and another and all the crimes the Shah allegedly had committed in Iran, I said, hey, enough of that. How long are we going to be here? And he said, you will be here until the Shah is returned to Iran. And I said, well, then we will be here forever because you're never going to get the Shah back. It's that simple. And then he laughed, and he was obviously there to try to raise our morale a bit. And he said, I'll be honest with you. We don't even care about the Shah anymore. What we want from the United States is an apology for the United States' transgressions and policy toward Iran since the Mossadegh era. And the minute he said that, and that was just the first of 4, I said, you're never going to get that, and I don't even want you to get it. Because that would be admitting to something that we were not responsible for. We were backing the legitimate regime in Iran then. We may have aided the Shah in getting back in, but in all our estimates then, that was the best for national security of Iran. Iran was in chaos at that time during the Mossadegh era because they'd stopped pumping oil. So it was clear that I didn't want those 4 demands, those 4 original demands, to be met by the United States, because I would have had to come home then and hang my head. And none of us really wanted to see that happen. We never lost our pride and our spirit as Americans, in other words.
I can see that.
Thank you very much. Earlier in the program, you talked about some of the psychological stress that you experienced not only for the entire 444 days, but during those difficult first 3.5 weeks when you were interrogated anywhere from 18 to 20 hours a day. How badly were you physically treated during this time?
Well, I don't know what point that serves, and I've said that before. I was mistreated physically. And to go into it now, I don't think serves any particular purpose, and I said that in my January press conference when I first returned home. Physical mistreatment is physical mistreatment. There was an awful lot of stress, especially the first 3 weeks, and then later during the mock firing squads, during the trips from one prison to another when you were never sure that you weren't going to be summarily shot somewhere along the way. You never knew when you moved from one place to another whether you were simply being moved or taking out to be shot. And in the kind of a communication vacuum we were in, you never really knew for sure what was going on.
Well, even on the night you left for Algeria, you had to practically walk down a line of assailants who were punching, kicking, doing everything they could to aggravate you just while you were walking to a plane.
That's right. The terror lasted right up till the time we were out of Iranian airspace, literally, because even after we run the Algerian aircraft, I sort of sensed, well, what if they use a Strela or a Red-Eye type missile somewhere off the airfield here to try to shoot the aircraft down? And there were a number of opposition parties in Iran, the Mojahedin or the Fedayeen or any number of the Tudeh party, the Communist Party, that would love to have embarrassed the Khomeini government by doing something like that at the nth hour. So the terror and the threat of terror was constant throughout the entire 444 days. And the way you learn to live with that kind of stress is just sort of tremendous thought control by being very careful how you think and setting certain times of the day aside so that you can allow those times for discussion and thought about the worst case possibilities. And the rest of the time you try to bury yourself in some reading or some healthy thoughts, as I call them, so that you don't have your mind just turn you into a raving maniac.
When did you first realize, you talked about that you didn't even feel safe when you got on the plane because it could have been shot down by missile. Was that the general feeling of others on the plane as well? Or was there some immediate show of joy?
Oh, there was a show of joy immediately after the takeoff from Marabad Airfield. But I think in fact, we were so overwhelmed at just seeing each other again and all that, this lingering fear that I had of a possibility of shooting the aircraft down wasn't an real active thing. It was just something in the back of my mind that we're really not out of the woods until we clear Iranian airspace or get some altitude where we'd be out of range of those short-range missiles.
You talk, again, I allude to an interview you gave several months ago. You talked about the internationalness of your return, and you talk about the Algerians and the Germans and the reaction that you received in Athens. Elaborate a little bit more on that, if you will.
Yeah, I think that our homecoming was an international event. My next door neighbors right now, they're in Atlanta, just came over from Germany and built a home next to us, and they refer to it as their hostages being returned too, because so many of the German people have close friends and relatives in the United States that they could really relate to it. I've spent almost 9 years living in Germany over the last 31 years. And, of course, started right out when we landed at Athens. The American community in Athens were out in the middle of the night.
Sure.
The American community in Algiers were out. And the Algerians on the aircraft were sharing our freedom with us, and they were just about as happy about that as they could be. And I think that's a fantastic example of a revolutionary country that is pulling itself up by the bootstraps in diplomatically the 20th century. And I was real proud of the Algerians' role in settling that thing, and the Algerians were very proud of it. Even the Algerian security people on that aircraft, and they had some tough-looking cookies on there. They were there to make sure that nothing happened to us once we got on that aircraft. But when we cleared Iranian airspace, they all joined in the celebration of freedom. And then, of course, we landed in Wiesbaden, and the Germans were lined up all along the Autobahn.
We got all the pictures on that. That was incredible.
That touched me
also
very
at the
much.
hospital. At the hospital, the nurses were hanging over the railing
Yes, weren't they?
as the hostages came up. All those nurses, I can see them, all the white uniforms, hanging, waving.
Have you had the opportunity, I know because of your celebrity status, and I know you don't like the term celebrity status, but you do have it. Have you had an opportunity to read all the magazines, to watch the television coverage of that day? Because I will say, as you will recall, that was a day when two of the most significant stories of the last 50 years were happening on the same day. We had the election or the swearing in of a president, and the hostages return. I think it's probably television's finest hour. Have you had an opportunity to look at the tapes of that day?
Yes, I have, some of them. And I've caught up on reading all the Newsweeks and Times and U.S. News and World Reports for the period while we were gone. And what I have seen of that day, I still cannot go through those things without getting choked up. You know, let's face it, that was a big day, and I was definitely emotionally involved in the Iran crisis right from the very beginning. But the big thing to me, as I've said every time I've had an opportunity to say it, is I saw there at least the beginning of a kind of a renaissance of patriotism in this country, and a kind of a rebirth of the spirit of unity that has made America great and won all our wars for us that we've won.
I didn't know we had lost it.
Well,
until this happened. I didn't know we had lost it.
Well, it happened gradually.
I'm sure that everyone felt patriotic about America. That is, most Americans, the majority of citizens.
Yeah, but
and that everyone felt that our country, right or wrong, we're at your side all the way. That's unity. And it wasn't until this crisis that I realized that this was bringing us together. Well, if it was bringing us together, then we must have been a little bit apart, which sort of let me down. I was surprised at that. I didn't think we were that far apart.
Well, I noticed it in the 60s when I had lieutenants that worked for me that wanted to let their hair grow beyond regulation because they said they couldn't get a date if the girls knew they were in the service.
Oh, gee.
You know,
Yeah.
and in the World War II America that I grew up in, that never happened. If a man was not in the service and he should have been, he couldn't get a date.
That's right. That's exactly right.
You have been involved in, or you are involved tomorrow night in the Glendale Heights Community Hospital. They're having a seminar on stress. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the seminar and where it's going to be held, and then I've got a phone number where people can call if they want additional information.
Well, it's at the Glendale Heights Memorial Hospital, and it'll begin at 7 o'clock, probably run a couple hours, but if I'm correct, it may even run longer than that, because sometimes we get wrapped up in things and people get interested, and it might go on a while longer than that.
And there'll be a question and answer session involving yourself at the same time?
It'll be primarily an opportunity for people to ask Dr. Malik and I questions about stresses and our stress and our perceptions of stress and how to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, he's the expert on it, and I'm the guinea pig when you come right down to it. I've been through some stress a time or two, not just in Iran, but 30 years service in the Army puts you under a certain amount of stress. I think all of us are under stress, you know. I think sometimes stress expands to fit the job. But I think it's something that we can all handle if we understand it a little better and take the stress idea out of the closet. You know, I've said today in a number of cases that I think going into a doctor and saying, I think I have or a psychiatrist and saying, I think I have a problem with stress there should be no more of a stigma attached to that than going in saying, I think I broke my right navicular bone in my wrist. But for years, there's been that stigma attached to anyone who goes in and asks for any kind of mental help that, you know, gee, he must be a kook or he's crazy, or they'll start wondering if you can keep your
appears
job.
to be caving in under stress.
That's right. You know, the old term nervous breakdown and all that had a very bad connotation.
That's a bad thing to admit that you're caving
And I
in
think,
under
you know, the first thing I wanted to do when I was released and in Wiesbaden, you know, after 444 days, I didn't really know whether I was in good shape or not. I thought I was, but let's face it, I was not exactly what you'd call a disinterested party in coming up with a clinical analysis of my own sanity. So I wanted to talk to a psychiatrist, and I did. We all did. They had them there at Wiesbaden to assist us, and some of the things they mentioned, I think, put us in real good shape to handle some of the normal stresses that we were going to undergo as a result of this freedom.
Mm-hmm.
If people would like more information as to the specifics of the session tomorrow night, the stress seminar where Colonel Scott will participate, you can call tomorrow, wait until 9 o'clock until the office opens, 858-9700, 858-9700. It's going to be out in Glendale Heights, Illinois, out on Jill Court, 1505 Jill Court out there, and if you'd like more information, 858-9700. A couple more questions which revert back to my questions earlier about the cooperation that some gave to the Iranians. On that trip back, you mentioned earlier you didn't want to name names as to those that might have provided some information or comfort to the enemy. On that trip back, on that long plane ride, did those people act differently?
I don't know. I just simply don't know. I spent my time talking to some of my close friends, and once we were on the Air Force aircraft, I immediately fell in love with the head nurse and spent a lot of time talking to her, so that sort of killed my evening on the trip back to Germany.
One other observation from that period of return to freedom was when President Carter, the day after the swearing in of his successor, Ronald Reagan, appeared to talk to all the hostages, appeared in Wiesbaden. What did he say to you?
Well, first of all, he came in to the room where we were. There were no press or anyone else in there except the 52 of us and former Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and a couple of the presidential aides, Ham Jordan, for example. He came in and embraced each one of us individually and then welcomed us back. And the rest of what was said in there was just for our ears, and I think it should be kept that way. But I would say that I was very much impressed that this human being who had just stepped down from being President of the United States took time out and came over there to welcome us home, because he had no requirement to do that. And I know that he realized that there may have been some who would not have been that happy to see him, and I think he is so much of a man and so much of a Christian that he didn't care about that. He wanted to come over and welcome us home anyway.
There's no doubt about that, Paul.
You know, I've met President Carter 4 times since then, and we have yet to shake hands. We still embrace every time we meet. I saw him last Saturday and spent about 2 hours talking to him at the 4th of July parade in Atlanta. And he's looking very well. The strain of all that problem and everything is draining away, and he's looking very healthy again.
Good for him.
There were reports in the Chicago Tribune that there were several hostages that attacked the president, that spoke ill of him as he attempted to embrace them. Again, we're not asking for names, but did that occur? Is that an accurate report?
I don't. If it did, I certainly didn't see it, and I was there.
When you look back on the entire experience, what is the one thought, the one emotion that you are left with?
I think thankfulness that I'm an American, that I live in a country that places that kind of value on human life, and it was willing to persevere for the period that it took to get us released. And I think it took tremendous patience on the part of both our government and the American people, and I give them great credit for it. We didn't have much of a choice. We had to be patient. And we, I think, recognized fairly early on that it was going to be a long ordeal, but we didn't want our country to compromise and embarrass itself or disgrace itself in order to get us released. And I don't think our country did. I think we've come out of it stronger, and the perceptions on the part of the rest of the world are that although we have awesome military strength, we won't use it arbitrarily against a smaller country, no matter how much we're insulted by that country, and I think that's a sign of strength rather than a weakness.
I do too, and I think that at no time did the United States of America truckle to a foreign power or bend the knee to it in any way. Held its head high and insisted on maintaining the principles that we believe in, and at no time did it ever say, well, I'll give in to this, or I'll give in to that, or let us mediate on this thing. No way. We wanted our hostages back, and we wanted them whole, unharmed, and we didn't want to have to pay any price for it.
On that note, we're out of time. Our thanks this evening to Colonel Charles Scott, one of the hostages held by the Iranians for 444 days. He retired from the Army after 31 years and 8 months in April of this year, just a couple of months ago. And Colonel Scott, it's a pleasure to meet you, and we thank you very much for joining us tonight. Jim Bishop has also joined us, veteran American journalist and author of a number of bestsellers, The Day Lincoln Was Shot, The Day Kennedy Was Shot, The Day Christ Died. His latest book is an autobiography called A Bishop's Confession, which is an exciting look at his career as an American journalist, the people that he's met along the way, presidents, FBI directors, great stories. It's also a personal story, a story that involves a lot of tragedy, sadness, and also happiness. There's a happy ending to this story, and Jim, we thank you very much for joining us this evening as well. I'm Bruce Dumont. That's Inside Politics for this Thursday night. We'll see you next Thursday night at 7 o'clock. So long, everybody.
If your afternoons are more enjoyable because of All Things Considered, we can do the same for your morning rush hours. Join us weekdays at 5 a.m. for Morning Edition for in-depth international and local news coverage produced by National Public Radio and WBEZ. Morning Edition not only provides unsensationalized news coverage, but traffic and weather updates as well. So set your wake-up alarm for Morning Edition, weekday mornings at 5, only on Chicago Public Radio at 91.5 FM, WBEZ, Chicago.